So I'm back to do another review, and I hesitate to call this a review because it's more of just a retrospective kind of discussion, the same way the Batman Chronicles Volume 1 video was more of just a retrospective discussion. So today we'll be talking about the Essential Captain America Volume 1. And for people that don't know, because they don't actually, as far as I can tell, they don't print these anymore. But it's basically Marvel's line of, it's the DC equivalent of what the showcases and the Chronicles are, where they just reprint the earliest stories from each character. With the exception of Captain America, because these issues collected are not actually the first appearances of Captain America. The Golden Age stuff with Captain America is collected in the Golden Age Omnibus. These are all the stories from the 60s after Cap was resurrected and brought into the Avengers. It's all of his appearances in Tales of Suspense from 59 all the way up to 99. And then you get Captain America 100 through 102. Because it kind of became his book at that point. So most of these issues, aside from 100, 101, and 102, all these issues are about 10 pages each, because the way the Tales of Suspense would work is you'd get 10 pages of a Captain America story, and then you'd get 10 pages of an Iron Man story, which is really interesting now, considering the state of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and everything post-Civil War in the comics. In the comics there was a contrived confrontation between Captain America and Iron Man, and then you get to the Cinematic Universe and you realize, well, it was contrived in the comics, but there is very much an inherent struggle between these two characters that we haven't really brought to the forefront. So the movies have been doing a really good job of compounding on these two characters and their differences and why they would come to blows. So the fact that they shared a book in the 60s is really interesting, that they were always kind of paired together. There was always a historical precedent for matching those two characters up. Now, Iron Man isn't in any of these Captain America issues. There might be like a stray issue where the Avengers show up, but it's basically Captain America's book. And it's a really interesting read, because Captain America is extremely broody. This is all after he wakes up from suspended animation. And at the time of these comics were printed, I think in 1965, World War II only ended 20 years ago. So everyone Cap knew during the war still had a very good chance of being alive. Technology hadn't changed that much, and the biggest thing Cap had to get accustomed to was the fact that he was gone before the end of the war, and that Bucky died, as well as the fact that culture has changed a little bit, because 60s culture is very different than the culture Steve would grow up in, but it's not something you couldn't assimilate to. That actually gets a little bit confusing, though, because he's in suspended animation, but there are constant references to Steve's age, and they don't say it like jokingly, like he's supposed to be 65 or something like that. They don't play on it that way. They actually go out of their way to make it look like Captain America is physically 20 years older, even though that's not how the suspended animation trick would work. And they don't collect the Avengers issue in which they find Captain America. So if in that appearance they address how he's in suspended animation, so he's able to stay alive but his body's still aged or something like that, then maybe that would make sense. But they never say it like that. They just say that he's perfectly preserved for 20 years. Yet when he comes out, he acts as if he's physically aged, and that's very strange to read. That stuff aside, this is a really fascinating read. At this point, Captain America hadn't become a very complex character, but Marvel is in a very strange place compared to DC, because Marvel doesn't really have a Silver Age. Now, some of Marvel's best characters, and Marvel as we know them now, emerged at the tail end of the Silver Age, but they never actually were part of what DC Silver Age would be. So the Silver Age of comics goes from 1950 to about 1970, and Marvel's best characters, Marvel's whole connected universe in comics, started in '61 with Fantastic Four. So Fantastic Four forward is the Marvel Universe we know. So they were in the last decade of the Silver Age. But since the very beginning, with Fantastic Four and with Iron Man and with Spider-Man, they were always pushing the boundaries of what you could do in comic storytelling. There's an issue collected here where Jack Kirby and Stan Lee decided to tell a story where the entire structure and dialogue is written in a Golden Age style. And you can't actually tell the difference. Aside from it being a little bit cleaner in the art department or being a little bit less dynamic in the panel layout, you can't tell the difference between the Golden Age and this tail end of the Silver Age story. And I think that's very indicative of Marvel style, that when they began from kind of a Golden Age mindset of, this is children's entertainment, but we're pushing the boundaries of it. They never had that period or that growing pain of, let's dumb everything down. There are characters that are as old, as some DC characters. There was a run of 50s comics with Captain America, but later they'd be retconned to the fact that someone else was just putting on the Captain America costume. But again, it's not the Marvel Universe as we know it. So that's really interesting. It's legitimately interesting to see how Marvel always began from a character-driven place, and always began as all of the Marvel heroes, all of their journeys were about self-discovery, and they became heroes through that self-discovery. It wasn't the DC mindset of these characters are ideals and we must look up to them. It's very much of, I can see why these characters are troubled and I'm rooting for them to get out of it so I can look up to them eventually. And the process that they go through in trying to become ideals is why we look up to them. Both are valid interpretations, both are valid ways of telling stories with superheroes. It's a very clear divide in the way Marvel and the way DC do things. At this point, Captain America wasn't really a fully formed idea yet. You notice all the way through the first half of this that Captain America as a title is still trying to find its place. It starts from a very broody place. In the very first issue has Captain America fighting up a bunch of gangsters, and the story's layout is essentially, well, he's just a glorified gymnast, so obviously we can take him out. And you get like a couple issues of this where criminals just attack Captain America because they think he all he can do is some aerobics, all he can do is jump around, and he's got a shield. There's no way he could be a threat. And it's very much about justifying the existence of Captain America, especially alongside the other Avengers. And after you get through that, you get to this point where they decide to transform the book. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby decide to transform the book into just tales from World War II. And that doesn't last very long. It only lasts a few issues. And then it gets back to the present, and it's more about the broody Captain America and the Captain America that's still trying to find purpose. And we root for him because his quest for purpose and his quest for meaning, as opposed to just laying there retiring, is why we like the character. We get the introduction of Sharon Carter in this, who's not actually Sharon Carter. She's still Agent 13, but she's never given a name, and there's a connection to a woman from Cap's past, and they don't really develop that very much. They just kind of introduce that romance factor. But again, all of this is just about the legacy of Captain America and how Steve Rogers is trying to figure out how to move on and where he's going to go. Some of the best stuff actually comes from the Red Skull, because we get the origin of the Red Skull, and it's actually really well done. It's extremely well handled considering the time period these comics were written in, and it's a wonder to me that no one has actually used this origin or retold this origin. Because the idea is Red Skull starts in a place of no power, complete poverty, stealing food just to survive, and eventually when Hitler comes to power, he realizes that that's what he wants to be. He wants to be the guy that can seize power and manipulate his way up, as opposed to just fighting for his very existence. And so he he starts trying to move up through the Nazi ranks, and at one point he's just serving Hitler his food, and Hitler sees some kind of anger and fuel in him that he recognizes in himself, and he molds Red Skull into the perfect symbol for what the Nazis are, the perfect symbol for what Hitler wants the world to look like. And he gives him a special costume, and he gives him the mask, the Red Skull mask, and he makes him into the Red Skull we know. And his final lesson is killing his teacher. And so the Red Skull's got this warped loyalty to the ideals of Nazism, although not necessarily Hitler. And they even dance around that because he's loyal to Hitler, but you always get like the sense of maybe he's not really. If Hitler ever went a different direction, he may not have followed him. And it's a good place to put the character in that Nazism creates a breed of personality that's unable to be contained, and that's the Red Skull. And he is very much the personification of everything in that philosophy. It's important that Red Skull always talks about himself as being pure evil. That he's trying very hard to make the fight in World War II about black and white, about good and evil, and no shades of gray. And Captain America's arc is completely in gray areas, in that yes, from his perspective fighting, yes, the Allies were the good guys and the Nazis were the bad guys, but look at what we lost, and look at all the torture we've been through, and look at all that's changed, and all that the war cost us. Are we ever really the good guys? Is there ever really a good guy in war? And that's really interesting, that the bad guy of the story, the antagonist of the piece, is the one that sees things in absolute good and evil, as opposed to the hero. The hero is the one that could very easily go either way, but doesn't. And you don't see that a lot. Even in Captain America comics, even modern stuff, even when you get up to stuff like Mark Waid's run and Brubaker's run, Captain America is still very much sort of a moral absolutist. In the cinematic universe, he's very much a moral absolutist. And he's not that way here. He's still kind of getting the hang of it, and he's still kind of trying to figure out what he wants to believe in and whether or not he wants to say Captain America. There's a point where he retires because he thinks that his devotion to duty and his devotion to being in the military is no longer justified. That he was there because World War II answered the call, answered a need, and that need's not there anymore. That the world is okay now, so what is he fighting for? And the only thing he can see is that this selfish need to give himself meaning. And that's really interesting. Ultimately, he decides to keep fighting because forces like the Red Skull are still out there, but he's still wrestling with the fact that, well, if I don't take out the Red Skull, I'm sure the Avengers can do it without me. And it's still kind of a weak foundation for him to go forward. And again, that's just really interesting that Captain America is not this big patriotic symbol that throughout all of these issues, there's never a mention of Captain America saying that it's the right thing to do because America did it. It has nothing to do with patriotism whatsoever. It's all about the consequences that symbol has cost him, and the consequences of what it's cost the world. And it never comes out right and says anything like America's the bad guy, or gives you the down and dirty truth of what the Cold War was like. But you get these hints, and a lot of it comes through from Jack Kirby's artwork, and then Stan Lee's narrations really help because he's really world building around Captain America. There's almost like a snide, I know we're supposed to be writing children's literature, but I'm just so angry about this issue kind of stuff going on here and there. And there's not enough to say that the book is telling you anything. It's not like the book has a message, but it feels like something subconsciously slipped in. Something about Stan Lee and Jack Kirby not enjoying the world they were in right now slipped into Captain America, and that Captain America is the perfect symbol of everything that they were uncomfortable with in their time period, as opposed to being a symbol of patriotism. And I think that's just really well handled. There's a great moment towards the middle of the book where Captain America is laying in his bed, and he says that he still, every time he closes his eyes or looks at his roof, he always sees the Red Skull's face looming over him. And he goes on this quest, and for most of the story, he's just dealing with the Red Skull and the Red Skull's sleeper drones. And there's a great moment where Captain America takes out what he thinks is the last sleeper drone, and it's got a giant Red Skull head in it, and it sinks into the ground, or sinks into the water, and it falls, and he thinks dies, as opposed to him surviving out of the water, and he thinks he's finally beaten it. But then he still has to deal with the fact that the Red Skull's alive, and it, in his mind, it triggers this idea of, I guess good and evil never die, and since the Red Skull sees himself as pure evil, he's not going to die. This is also where we get the origin of the Cosmic Cube. We get AIM scientists that create the Cosmic Cube, and they give it to the Red Skull, and Cap's able to beat him, and the cube is lost, but Skull survives. But again, it still feeds into this absolute power motif, because the cube can give the Skull whatever he wants, and he does things like wears suits of armor and tries to become this very definitive symbol. He becomes a king. He tries to become royalty. He tries to make this cosmological claim about the nature of good and evil in the universe, and that he is so far in the evil space, and he's trying to rub that into the world. And Cap is not ready to accept that he's in the good space, and it gives a really interesting dynamic to their conflict. And the Cosmic Cube is something that kind of haunts Steve because it is absolute power, and Captain America at this point doesn't know if he believes in absolutes. Again, this isn't really a review, so I can't say anything that's necessarily good or bad. This is more of just like a fun historical perspective to get on a character that is so popular now. Although I think it is actually really good. If you compare this to the other Essential Collection at the time, or the other characters at the time, the Fantastic Four stuff, the Spider-Man stuff, the Doctor Strange stuff, the Hulk stuff, anything in that era of Marvel, I think this is probably the best. Now, I'm not the biggest Spider-Man fan, so I'm sure someone like Dan Torrey will tell me that how great Spider-Man gets later down the line, and I believe him. But for my money, I think Captain America is definitely the most complex of any of this right off the bat, because the Fantastic Four still had dysfunction, family dysfunction, that made them interesting in the beginning. Iron Man, not so much. Iron Man didn't really have an identity until Michelangelo Layton took over. The Hulk, I think, got more interesting as time went on, particularly when Peter David came along, which is just years and years later. So I think Captain America is the one that's got the most complexity right off the bat. He's still not amazingly complex, but there's, especially reading all of these issues in bulk, reading like 44 issues of Captain America comics at once, it gives you this great sense, this great macro view of how this character evolved and how he's taking his baby steps into becoming who we know now. I definitely recommend picking this up. I'm not sure if it's still in print. Remember that this is not the same thing as the Golden Age Omnibus. This is the stuff after Cap was revived, and so if you're looking for those Avengers issues where Captain America is de-thawed, it's not in this trade. Although that issue should be. That should be where it opens, but oh well, it's not there. That's probably in the Avengers Essential Collections. I'm sure an Epic Collection at some point will collect that. This is basically just Cap's story, and there are lots of references and lots of notes that say see Avengers number or whatever, and none of those Avengers issues will be in here. It's probably a good companion piece to read with that, but that's just fair warning. So thanks everybody for listening. Let me know what you thought in the comments, whether you agree or disagree. Make sure to follow me on Twitter, where I talk about anything and everything all day and every day. So that'll be fun. You get to hear me talk nonstop. Let me know what you guys thought of the review and the book in the comments, and I'll see you guys next time for another video.